David, when you made the switching, Monte and I fell off the co-host.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, you should both be co-hosts now. Is that so?
I'm going to double check here. Yes. Now you got Bud Racine as the co-host, not Monte.
Oh,
Morning, Rodney.
that should do it.
I'm on.
Okay, we're fine.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad to see you all, and I'm glad to hear that you're going to be participating in this subject, which I find very interesting. Acts chapter 17, beginning with verse 22, second half. This is Paul's speech to the people on Mars Hill. New Revised Standard Version. Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, he made all the nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said. So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, there's much in this speech that we find majestic, but some things that we find perplexing. One of them is the tension between the idea that we are all from one ancestor and therefore very much alike. And on the other hand, we have our different times and places, which also have to be respected. So somehow we need to be one and yet many, and we need to be many and yet one. That's not altogether easy for us. This issue of critical race theory is just a small part of all of that, but let's be able to help each other and learn from each other and to learn from your presence with us today. In Christ's name, amen. Today's topic is critical race theory and Christianity. It should be critical race theories and Christianities. This is because both are pluralistic. The following recurring themes are expounded in one of the most widely used and highly regarded textbooks on the subject. It is Critical Race Theory and Introduction, 3rd edition by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, New York University, 2017. Husband and wife, critical theorists both, they write. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. First, racism is ordinary, not aberrational. It is normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country, that is the United States. The second feature, sometimes called interest convergence or material determinism, adds a further dimension because racism benefits both white elites materially and working class whites psychically. Large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate it. A third theme of critical race theory, the social construction thesis, holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations, not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. A final element concerns the notion of a unique voice of color. It holds that because of their different histories and experiences with oppression, Black, American Indian, Asian, and Latino writers and thinkers may be able to communicate to their white counterparts matters that the whites are unlikely to know. Minority status, in other words, brings a presumed competence. Delgado and Stefanczyk on the differences among critical race theories about human rights. They say, color blindness can be admirable, as when a governmental decision maker refuses to give in to local prejudices. But it can be perverse, for example, when it stands in the way of taking account difference in order to help people in need. In our system, rights are almost always procedural, for example, to a fair process, rather than substantive, for example, to food, housing, or education. Rights are almost always cut back when they conflict with the interests of the powerful. Rights are said to be alienating. They separate people from each other. Stay away, I've got my rights, rather than encouraging them to force close, respectful communities. With civil rights, lower courts have found it easy to narrow or distinguish the broad, ringing landmark decisions like Brown versus Board of Education. The group that supposedly benefits always greets cases like Brown with great celebration. But after the singing and dancing die down, the breakthrough is quietly cut back by narrow interpretation, administrative obstruction, or delay. In the end, the minority group is left little better than it was before, if not worse. Its friends, the liberals, believing that the problem has been solved, go on to a different campaign, such as saving the whales. Yet a determined group maintains that rights are not a snare and a delusion, rather they can bring genuine gains. Now here are some key concepts from their very long term of long glossary, and I think in the interest of time, so that others have an opportunity to speak more, I will move forward. There is a consensus among critical race theorists that the two primary sources of their thought and action are the Frankfurt School and Derek Bell. A proposal: the more a critical race theory owes to the early Frankfurt School, the more it dismisses human rights. The more it owes to Derek Bell, the less it dismisses human rights. This difference makes a difference. Now, I've asked Peter to give us a report on the Frankfurt School because he's an expert in European history. So, Peter, over to you. Where is Peter? There we go, Peter. It's up to you.
He needs to unmute.
Okay. You didn't realize I was going to abbreviate it that much. So, fair enough.
Peter, you're still muted.
Okay, I'm on.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
Thank you, David. Good morning to all. As David mentioned in his introduction, there is a strong connection between the critical race theory and critical theory. Critical theory, we should define it first. It's a sociological and philosophical school of thought that aims at analyzing and criticizing the society and culture in light of Marxist solutions and teachings. It was formed in Germany in 1923 by Felix Weil. This was the son of a man that was importing grain from Argentina and made his money. And his son, Felix, decided to use some of this money to form the school, known as the Frankfurt School. Well, he was doing basically what Marx was doing with the money that he got from his friend Friedrich Engels, that was also getting money from capitalist means and promoted Marxism and socialist ideas. Well, Felix created this school. The initial name was Institute for Social Research, and it was located in Frankfurt, Germany, and it was attached to Goethe School. This school of thought very soon was recognized by the German government. As I mentioned, it was formed in 1923. In 1923, it started a period in the history of Germany that was called the Weimar Republic. It lasted until 1933. How it came to be? We know that at the end of World War I, Germany was defeated and the revolution started, like in Russia. And the Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. He took refuge with his family in Holland. And Germany became a republic. And immediately after this revolution, the communists tried several times to take over. And the government was able to put down the communist putsches with putting together some of the remnants of the German army. Then this was a time when this school was formed, when the communist and Marxist idea was widespread in Germany. It lasted, as I mentioned, from 1923 until 1933. You recall that in 1933, Hitler came to power, and Hitler closed the school. The school moved for a short period of time to Switzerland and then moved to New York at Columbia University. I should mention a few of the proponents of this school, the most important among them. Hockenheimer, Max Hockenheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, Pollock, Bernstein, to mention only a few of them. They were the proponents of this school. What are the main ideas of this school? Well, in the beginning, they were interested in publishing studies that were referred to labor and anti-Semitism. And of course, the interpretation was done in light of Marxist ideas, Marxist solutions. And basically, that was the original aim of the school when Felix Weil invented the school to spread Marxism in Germany and to have some of these Marxist ideas applied to the German society to solve some problems that Germany was facing after World War I. Attention of the school was given to psychoanalysis. What they tried to do was to create a connection between psychoanalysis and Marxism. And that was, of course, with the interest in Freud and especially in his idea of instinct. Then to create, the main aim was to create a link between base and superstructure. These are two terms used by Marx in Das Kapital. What is in practice, it's a connection between the ideology, the Marxist ideology, and the socioeconomic, which was called the base. Well, of course, this it has not very good results. This school, another idea that was promoted, it was criticizing, of course, capitalism. It was criticizing also the modern society. It was also revealing the pathology of capitalism. Was promoting social emancipation. It was promoting also redistribution of goods and social equality. These were a few of the main ideas that these people were promoting, known as the Frankfurt School. A few of the solutions that they offered for in order to correct the evils of the so-called capitalist society. Well, actually, the critics of this school argued that the solution they offered were not two viable solutions. Herbert Marcuse was publishing a book called The Great Refusal. And the idea that he was promoting for correcting the evils in the capitalist society was absenteeism. In other words, he recommended that the people should refrain from participating in the political process. Another idea was redistribution of goods. And another idea was the social equality. Well, basically, I like to take my own now on these ideas promoted by the critical theory, Frankfurt theory. They call it a realistic utopia, which is in my view, it's a misnomer because there are not realistic utopias. There are utopias or something that really happened. And basically what this is, it's a repacking of Marxist and socialist ideas that have produced so much misery throughout the world and over 100 million people dead. In regard to the social equality that was promoted by this school, I like to quote one of the great historians of our times, Francis Fukuyama, that in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, is dealing with this problem, is describing what produced this Marxist experience in the Soviet Union. And he states, the Marxist project sought to promote an extreme form of social equality at the expense of liberty by eliminating natural inequality through the reward not of talent, but of need, and through the attempt to abolish the division of labor. All future efforts to push social equality beyond the point of a middle-class society must contend with the failure of the Marxist project. For in order to eradicate those seemingly necessary and ineradicable differences, it was necessary to create a monstruously powerful state. The Soviets tried to reward the need rather than work or talent, but only at the cost of a society that lost its interest in working. And this communist society ultimately ended up accepting a substantial degree of social inequality. What Milovan Djilas, he was a communist philosopher in Yugoslavia. He was number 2 after Tito. He labeled this, what happened in the Soviet Union, with the new class, which was formed from party officials and bureaucrats. In other words, what they did, they destroyed the class of aristocracy that was based on blood, and they created a new class called the new class that was formed from party activists and bureaucrats. Not too much change. Another idea that, as I mentioned, was promoted by these scholars, this school of Frankfurt, was the idea of abstaining from participating in the political process, as I mentioned, promoted by Henry Marcuse. Well, this doesn't go anywhere because if people will abstain from participating in the political process, that will not accomplish anything. The idea of retribution also that is advocated by them, it was tried in the Old Testament in somehow form. As you recall, it was done every 7 and 50 years when those that lost their properties were receiving them back. But this didn't solve permanently the problem of social inequality, because after this happened, after 7 years and 50 years, the social inequality appeared again. Some people contend that the Nordic countries were successful models of socialism. Well, actually, in reality, these countries, or Scandinavian countries, they do not call themselves socialist countries. And what happened in this country, it's a kind of mixture between a free market economy and the private sector with the state control of some sectors of the economy. But socialism is totally different. socialism means a total control almost of all sectors of the economy and media and basically whole life of and whole society. It's what's happening in northern countries. It's something different. It's not socialism as some people will try to think. And now, how capitalism, which is not a perfect society, try to deal with some of these problems, inequality and some other problems that exist in every society and also exist in capitalism. Well, in my view, the capitalist states try to deal with this problem with the social programs, many social programs that they create, and something like affirmative action, other social programs. Also, with the direct intervention of state to correct or to balance some of this inequality that exists. I will not argue that this is a perfect solution, but I like to say that capitalism is trying to deal with some of these problems. As David mentioned, the Frankfurt School or critical theory influenced what is happening in the United States today and this much debated critical race theory. And I like to recommend a book that appeared just a few days ago, written by Mark Levin. He's an attorney. And the title of the book is American Marxist. He's explaining critical race theory, how it appears, and what is trying to deal with, and all the problems of this society is creating. And now, my point of view, from the Christian point of view of all these problems. Well, trying to deal with social inequality is not something new. And these people, the way they are trying to create this realistic utopia or perfect society, is not realistic because they try to create a perfect society discarding the human frailties. As we know, humans are not perfect. How can imperfect people can create perfect society? That is not possible. And in the history of Christianity was a theologian in the 5th century. His name was Pelagius. He tried to recommend how to create this kind of perfect Christian society and how to deal with these inequalities. Well, he is the author of The Free Will. And he believed that humans, basically the original sin didn't affect too much the human nature. And humans, through free will, they are able to correct themselves and to correct the society in which they are living. But he was strongly criticized by the church fathers, especially by Augustine, that clearly stated that humans are not able to create something perfect without the divine help. This will be a few of my takes on the critical theory. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for giving us an overview of the Frankfurt School. And thank you also for giving us your own views of the matter. Let me see if I can get my outline back up here. Okay, the more critical race theory owes to the early Frankfurt School, I think, the more it dismisses human rights, the more it owes to Derek Bell, the less it dismisses human rights. So now I'd like to go to the thought of Derek Bell and go back up here and revisit some of the things that I previously skipped over. Derek Bell was a civil rights lawyer who was born in the Pittsburgh area, went to Duquesne University, and then to the University of Pittsburgh Law School, after which he worked for the Department of Justice in the federal government. However, at some point along the way, the Department of Justice asked him to resign his position in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they thought his membership there constituted a conflict of interest, at least in the eyes of some. So instead of doing that, instead of resigning from the NAACP, he resigned the Justice Department, and he became a representative of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People down in the South. And he, I think it was about 300 cases he took to the courts on behalf of people who were being treated unfairly in the South. In due course, Harvard University hired him to teach at their School of Law, and he taught courses on civil rights there. Eventually, there was some discord or disagreement because he thought some people should be promoted, given tenure, and they were persons of color. The school thought not, so he resigned. Then, in due course, after a little bit, he was at the University of Oregon as the dean of the School of Law there, but he resigned from them too because he had nominated two persons of color for the faculty, and the university denied those nominations because they thought the people weren't qualified. So if I have it right, he went back to Harvard and then went back down to the New York University and spent the last 20 years of his life teaching civil law there and writing on these matters. So he is thought to be the second father of critical race theory. And I think there's a difference between him and the Frankfurt School, that is the early Frankfurt School. And I think we need to be attentive to that. Now, the mood of his writings, I think, is very intense. He can be sarcastic, he can be cutting, he can be almost offensive, but it all comes from a very broken heart, and one can feel in his writings that brokenness. It reminds me of a person who's just discovered that his or her spouse has been unfaithful for years, and there's rage about that, but there's also grief about that. And one feels in Derek Bell's writings both the rage and the pain. And I don't feel that combination so much in some of the other writings, but for me, it's very, very powerful, although it leaves me feeling somewhat melancholy. Okay, one of the things he did was to tell stories. And these stories were fictional for the most part about race relations, and they were widely read. So counter storytelling, writing that aims to cast doubt on the validity of accepted premises or myths, especially ones held by the majority. Derek Bell was well known for that. Then he was also well known for critical legal studies, a legal movement that challenged liberalism from the left, denying that law is neutral, that every case has a single correct answer, and that rights are of vital importance. I did not put that last line in yellow because I don't believe that represents his point of view. I think the first three lines do, but not the fourth. After all, he was a civil rights lawyer. He taught civil rights. He was identified as a civil rights lawyer in his own books. He has forwards in his books written by people who talk about the importance of continuing the struggle, even though it's very, very difficult, and even though success is not likely. Interest convergence was another idea, thesis pioneered by Derek Bell, that the majority group tolerates advances for racial justice only when it suits its interest to do so. he talks about Brown versus education as occurring only when it was in the interest of white people to do so. It was not sacrificial on their behalf for Black people. It was in the interest of white people to do so. Now, I think, yes, of course. Bell is somewhat melancholy when he writes that racism is permanent and that white people will release power only when it suits their interest. And I agree with him. Racism is permanent, and white people will reduce its effectiveness only when it suits their interest to do so. But I would have thought that would be quite obvious, and I don't think it altogether that surprising. And I think this is why Martin Luther King Jr. often emphasized that liberating Black people would liberate white people as well. So we need to take this convergence theory seriously and show how it is effective in encouraging white people. Okay, the principle of involuntary sacrifice. Bell says that the cost of civil rights advances are always placed on Blacks or low-income whites. And he really surprised a lot of people by condemning busing of children. He said what happened is that busing children from one neighborhood to the other made the white liberals feel good that they were doing something helpful, but in fact, it really was difficult on the children who were taken from one neighborhood and put in another neighborhood and placed in a context for which they were not prepared. His view was that Brown versus the Board of Education should not have struck down the separate part of the separate but equal doctrine, but it should have insisted that all the schools be equal. Don't try to avoid separation, try to avoid inequality. And he felt that a lot of money, a lot of energy, a lot of commotion was caused by busing these children, and the advance of civil rights was put on their backs, he said. Well, that made him a little bit controversial. So there's consensus that I've already read that, and I've read that. And I think the difference between the kind of critical rights theory we have in Bell, which champions civil rights, even though he can be very caustic and cutting about them, is different from the kind of critical race theory that we get some forms of the early Frankfurt School. Okay, we've heard from Peter, you've heard from me. Now, what are the Christian responses? Christians are responding to critical race theory in 4 predictable ways. Some condemn it, some commend it, some split the difference, some sidestep the issue. All 4 options have surfaced in recent annual meetings of the Southern Baptist Convention. With around 14 million members, down from 16 million in 2016, about 8,000 messengers or delegates to each annual meeting, it is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. The Southern Baptist Convention is therefore an interesting case study. Stephen Feinstein, the young senior pastor of the Sovereign Way Christian Church in Victorville, California, about 45 miles north of Loma Linda, proposed at the 2019 Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting in Birmingham, Alabama, a strongly worded condemnation of all aspects of critical race theory. That was option 1. Some members of the 2019 Resolutions Committee commended CRT, at least in part. That was option 2. The Resolution Committee considered the matter, worked out a compromise, and returned to the full assembly of 8,000 people with Resolution 9. Resolution 9 accepted critical race theory as an analytical tool, but rejected it as a worldview. That's option number 3. This satisfied a majority of the messengers in the full assembly who approved it with their votes. A sizable minority believed that Resolution 9 deviated too far from Pastor Feinstein's original proposal. They made plans to introduce a different resolution at the June 2020 annual meeting in Orlando, Florida. But that annual meeting was canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was not rescheduled. In the autumn of 2020, the presidents of all 6 of the Southern Baptist Convention's theological seminaries in North America issued a strong condemnation of critical race theory. Many Southern Baptists applauded their statement. However, it prompted 4 African American congregations to exit the denomination. Messengers to the June 2021 annual meeting, just over here, just a few weeks ago, in Nashville, Tennessee, received about 40 proposed resolutions. Around 10 of them were more or less about critical race theory. The 2021 Resolutions Committee considered the matter and returned to the full assembly with Resolution 2. It said nothing about critical race theory either way. This is option 4. Instead, Resolution 2 highlighted the sufficiency of Scripture on this and all issues and condemned all racism as sin. The full assembly voted its approval. No one knows for certain what the 2022 annual meeting will vote on this or any subject. This is because the messengers who assemble each year speak only for themselves without formally binding either the congregations or subsequent annual meetings. So, my reactions to this. 1, I think Resolution 2 was wise not to use language that needlessly offended some people. Secondly, I think they were right to appeal to Scripture as having many resources with which to deal with this problem. But I think that they should have dealt with the whole of Scripture and not part of it. And that would have caused them to have more attention to corporate institutional evil as well as individual sin. Sin becomes very individualistic in Resolution 2, whereas I think it's important to read the rest of the Bible and see how it criticizes institutional sin as well as corporate sin. So read the Bible, of course, but read the whole of it, but it's not sufficient. There are many things we should know about this that are not in the Bible. We need to hear from sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, legal experts, economists, people in the medical sciences. All of these people need to make a contribution to our understanding of critical race theory in addition to our study of the Bible. So I think, yes, Scripture, the whole of it, is necessary, but not sufficient. Now, I do think Scripture is important in the other direction in 2 ways. 1, I believe that some forms of critical race theory are insufficiently attentive to the welfare and well-being of individuals. I know Christianity is criticized for being too individualistic, but there is a sense in which it is properly individualistic. One of these is that we have come to the place that we no longer hold the group accountable for what one person in the group does. That was the message in Exodus 20. God visits the evil of the parents upon the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, and so forth. But when we get into Ezekiel, Ezekiel says, no more are you to say that. Now, each person who sins will be responsible for his or her own sin and not accountable for whatever the group did. And I think there is a tendency in some CRTs to hold people accountable, wrongly hold people accountable for what happened in previous years for which they're not responsible. Now, Abraham Joshua Heschel had a good line on this. He said, "We are not all guilty, but we are all responsible." That is, we can't help anything that happened in the past, and we should not bear that burden of guilt. But we are responsible for what we do in our own time and in our own place. I think there's another issue here, and that is the idea of changing society by first changing the superstructure of society, and then individuals will change. I think that's problematic. We have in our own history two great Baptist preachers, Martin Luther King Jr. and Billy Graham. They did this differently, but I think we need both. We need a King who's addressing the social problems, and we need a Graham who's addressing the personal problems, and that we should not side one way or the other. And I think some forms of CRT are so focused on the collective, so focused on the community, so focused on the society, that the importance of the particular individual is overridden, and human rights are thought to be dispensable. So I think there's lots of promise in critical race theory. I would say let's pay more attention to what Derek Bell says than to those who have been deeply influenced by the early proponents at the Frankfurt School. Now, Robert Ford has written a commentary that I'd like to put up here because I thought it was very, very helpful. Let me see if I can get it up. Having a hard time getting a hold of that.
You have it up. It looks fine. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, over to you, Bob.
Okay. Before I begin, were you able to send this to all our participants?
I did. I sent it first in Word, and that some people weren't able to open that. So I sent it again this morning on a PDF.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. Let me just say another little disclaimer before I read it. These are very complex issues. I'm approaching this more from a personal family perspective, people that I know, experiences I went through. I don't mean to demean what people did in the past, and I think your counsel that you just said about looking at the past, not feeling guilty about the past, but then taking responsibility by learning from the past and then moving forward. And that's what I would like to try to say in my comment, if that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to read this and then we'll have some questions. It says, of course, the Frankfurt School analysis was a left of center analysis, some of it building on ideas by Marx about alienation and class struggle in the 19th century capitalism. Marcuse and others later used the idea of critical theory to simply explain that good social analysis requires that we recognize our biases and cultural influences, as well as media biases, that affect our ability to dispassionately evaluate the fundamental drivers in how people react to reality in society, in the economy, and politics. I'm hoping that you, I'm talking not just you, Dave, but the class, will point out that the idea of social criticism of both systems and individual biases goes back to Jesus and others who called for open assessment of how we individually are often shaped by surrounding forces that we don't often recognize. That is what Jesus was telling Zacchaeus and Nicodemus and his own disciples. And I might add the rich young ruler or the Good Samaritan. Being honest about the mote in someone else's eye versus the log in our own eye is a fundamental human reaction and ethical need. But critical theoretical analysis of those realities needs to go beyond just decrying the problems, but put into action and taking personal responsibility. In the realm of religion, that is the fundamental idea behind liberation theology, as it was expressed in Catholic circles. And our old friend Charles Steele, of course, studied this a lot, and it was much about what the Stahl Center is about at La Sierra University. The same was and is the case from my ancestors, my grandparents, Orly and Lillian Ford. Some of you may have read about their book, These Fords Still Run, when they went to South America in the 1920s, as well as my parents' work in Central America. They were all willing to speak out and take the side of oppressed peoples, but not in revolutionary ways, but yet quite active, much more so than some SDA, GC, or division leaders today. And we can discuss whether that's true or not. I'm not trying to be demeaning in any way. Maybe you've followed, some of you may have followed Ron Lawson's writing about the church worldwide as to how it deals with human injustice and politics, as well as race, I should add there, particularly as it affects the low and middle class and the poor, versus church leaders who often cozy up to political leaders, even outright fascists and autocrats like Bolsonaro in Brazil today, or some of the early juntas in Guatemala, which I knew about and was living there at the time, or the benign dictator in Rwanda, Kagame. I was an academic dean at our university in Rwanda, and I dealt with some of the issues there. The excuse, now maybe that's the wrong word, but the excuse often given by leadership is to, quote, avoid politics. But yet when real atrocities are demonstrated, little is done. Or they avoid commenting. They can't or shouldn't, in my perspective, have it both ways. Claim to be non-political, but yet cozy up to dictators or even good governments when the going gets tough. This, of course, happened with Hitler and the SDA Church as well. That has happened over and over again. One example, in Central America, the Union office was moved from Guatemala to Costa Rica during the period that Robert Falkenberg, one of our previous General Conference president, was the mission president in Honduras. And then when he went to the Union, then in Guatemala, and then saw it move to Costa Rica. Primarily, he was known as a hobnobber with the junta and other political people, and ignored many youth and indigenous SDAs who felt the church should speak out about oppression of the poor and corruption in government. The Union office moved from Guatemala to Costa Rica, partially because that is where UNADECA, the Central American Adventist University, is located, but also because the government there is less corrupt and more democratic. That is on the surface a very good thing. But if you look at what actually was happening, it was a cop-out. That's my perspective. This was during the time that the Sandinistas took over Nicaragua, and many SDA youth joined guerrilla forces fighting the right-wing governments in El Salvador and Guatemala. We can understand the, quotes, institutional perspective why Falkenberg and later De Perlas, as a later Union president, preferred going to a safe place like Costa Rica. And then, of course, these same patterns continued under Falkenberg and others when they went to the Inter-American Division in Miami, where they have been heavily influenced, and this is my assessment, by the Cuban SDA lobby to be very pro-American and anti-communist, which often meant not speaking up to atrocities by both the right and left governments to protect church investments in buildings, offices, hospitals, etc. My parents faced similar problematic decisions when they were in leadership at the Belize mission, then Honduras, and the Nicaragua missions, both when right-wing governments were in power and when the left governments were in power. These decisions were particularly difficult in El Salvador, where the director of USAID at the time, this was the 1980s to the early 2000s, was an Adventist, and a good friend, by the way, who provided a very large grant to the church to build the boarding school in El Salvador. We can talk about that later. Some of you follow me on Facebook, I have put up some pictures from the 30th anniversary of the building of that school that I attended in 2013. And there are strong differences between how the mission conference leadership approached things versus many of the youth and the lower class Seventh-day Adventists. I'm not sure what the solutions are. They are complex, and we need to be understanding of how our church leaders make their decisions. But we also need to think critically, going back to this critical theory idea, about whether our approaches have been either very naive or at worst in collaboration with bad characters. These are some of the issues I hope you will discuss. I have many direct examples of how SDAs took different sides on these issues. Some were very revealing. For instance, while I was at Unedited, this was when it was only a high school back in the 60s in Costa Rica, I did my first part of high school there in Costa Rica before I went to Rio Lindo Academy. And by the way, Dave, I think you and I were together at Rio Lindo Academy.
We were.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, our boys' dean in Costa Rica recounted how he had been a college student during the Cuban Revolution at our SDA college in Cuba. He and many other students, particularly those from Central America, had often served as runners of messages for Castro's guerrilla army, who were located in the mountains near our SDA college. At the same time, the college administration, many who were, and I'm using the term right-wing supporters of the dictator in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, some of you may remember that history, kicked out many of those students. My dean had, this was before he became a dean, had to move to Monterrey in Mexico to finish his education. He then went back to Costa Rica to our secondary school while I was there to serve the church. During the first year that I was at the school in Costa Rica, the Castro regime took over in Cuba, and many, of course, anti-Castro people fled to Florida and Central America. And many of them were Seventh-day Adventists. We got a new school president at our school in Costa Rica who was a Cuban, a very fine gentleman, and there were many other faculty. In fact, I worked in the carpenter shop there to work my way through school. And the chief carpenter, the head of the shop, was a Cuban refugee, Pedrito. Some of you may remember him. Unfortunately, there were other, when they took over, our dean was demoted and kicked out because they remembered his activism back in Cuba. He was considered to be too closely allied with the Fidel Castro movement. He eventually emigrated to the US. He became a doctor, from what I understand. And there were many other young pastors in training who felt the church would be more open, and they left. I, to this day, know several of my colleagues, former roommates from Costa Rica, who left the church because they felt that the church hierarchy was not open to the political and social and racial issues of Central America. Now, these discussions have continued through the years to this very day in Central America. But I also saw it in Haiti and in Dominican Republic, and later in Mexico and Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru. I remember when my uncle, who was the hospital administrator at our nursing school in Nicaragua, he was forced to give up the school and hospital to Cuban doctors who came in with the Sandinista regime. My parents were still in Honduras at the time, but later my dad went back as the new mission president in Nicaragua during the early years after the Sandinista victory. It was a tough situation being an Adventist pastor in that period. I was at Rio Lindo and later at PUC at the time, but my younger brother and sisters were in Honduras and Nicaragua, and they have kept in touch with several former Adventist friends who left the church and joined the Sandinista government. I later met many of these former SDAs who had joined the revolution while I worked for USAID in 1999 to 2003. This is in Washington, the U.S. Agency for International Development. At the time, I was leading out in a major agricultural project, and it focused, a lot of the focus was on helping former revolutionaries in Central America leave the guerrilla warfare and move back to their farms. Well, when at the time, some of you may remember Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina. He headed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Of course, and I had worked with some of these Sandinista people, through this USAID contract. I also ran into some of the right wingers that were supporting Jesse Helms, like Oliver North, and then, of course, who had supported the Contras who fought the Sandinistas. Next week, I'll talk more about it, but many of the Bay Islanders in Honduras, where I grew up, also supported the Contras. The Contras, of course, were those fighting against the Sandinistas. Many of them are ship owners, and they smuggled arms to the Sandinistas. To this day, there is a strong right-wing bias among SDAs in the Bay Islands. More about that next week when I make my presentation. Personally, I was caught between both sides, politically and personally, and I was particularly pilloried by one named Roger Noriega. He's a nephew, a former relative of the Panamanian dictator of a few years back. And he became a close staff member for Jesse Helms and Oliver North, by the way. And he forced me and my boss to come before a congressional committee, and he threatened to cut off USAID grants because we were giving funds, quote, to former communist rebels and sympathizers. Of course, we were simply trying to help people that were dispossessed and had lost their farms to regain and to move away from guerrilla activities. Now, I know that these are complex issues, and I thank you for being willing to discuss them, but I will take some care. It will take care in moderating the discussion so it becomes useful and not polemical. Some of these issues are with no solution, but I do believe the church needs to be more aware of what happened in the past and what is still happening. And if I might just end, Dave, by saying that, as you mentioned earlier, we can't be guilty about what happened in the past, and particularly when we were children or before we were even born. But I think we are responsible to know what happened in the past and to learn from it. And then we should take responsibility. We can learn from it, and whether it's in the personal basis, how we relate to people, but I think there's also something we need to learn institutionally. And so I leave it to you now to lead in our discussion. I hope I did not insult any people. Some of this is very personal, I know, but I thank you for listening. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Bob. You're going to have to work harder than that if you want to insult us. That was a very helpful presentation and dramatic. I did not realize you were called up before that congressional committee and asked to account for your activities. That must have been very, very stressful.
Well, it was. First, this was Noriega, who was the chief of staff to Jesse Helms, and he threatened to cut the entire USAID budget if we didn't stop sending any money to, quotes, communists. And so my boss, I was an analyst, okay, and then my boss and I had to go first before Jesse Helms and Noriega himself, and then we had to go before a committee. And actually, the committee was very nice to us because and so it worked out. But we had to make some changes in our grant. We had to bring in other companies. I was doing a very unusual project for an adventist at the time. I was helping former coffee producers, okay, smallholder coffee producers throughout Central America, but also in Ethiopia and Eritrea, to learn to use more conservation-oriented coffee production. And this was a project that was run jointly with the Smithsonian Institution. It was called the Bird Friendly Coffee Project. And the idea was to help small farmers protect the forest that would under which the coffee was grown, and then to produce specialized coffee that you would buy today from Seattle's Best or from whatever. But anyway, Jesse Helms forced us to start working with some of the big corporate coffee producers, which we weren't. We were working with smallholder coffee producers, some of them who had been former communist rebels. And so we had to bring in Monsanto, and we had to bring in Folgers Coffee, and we had to talk to all sides. That was the solution.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. It's time for us to take a break.
Mhm.
When we come back, I'd like to hear from Julius Nam if he can stay. I just heard from Julius this morning and learned that he's been doing a lot of research on this topic from a legal point of view because he's an attorney. So we will schedule him for a full session, I hope, sometime in the future. But if he can stay by, let's hear from him a few minutes after the break. And if he can't stay by, we'll move right ahead with our discussion. Thank you, Julius. We really are glad to see you, and I hope we can hear from you. But if not, we'll get together down the road somewhere. So it is now about 11:41. Let's reconvene in 10 minutes. That would make it about 11:51. And I'll turn off the recording and turn off Facebook for now.
Okay, I'm watching. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll